Welcome. This is Writing for Your Life, and we are here with our second Tuesday series. I'm really, really excited and just delighted to have one of my favorite writers here and one of our longtime friends of Writing for Your Life, Elizabeth Jarrett Andrew. Elizabeth is an author, very prolific. She is a writing coach, a teacher, a spiritual director, and co founder of Eye of the Heart Center for Creative Contemplation. Elizabeth, as I said, has been a longtime friend of Writing for Your Life, of Brian Elaine, who was the founder of Writing for Your Life. She's published many, many books, and I know she's going to tell you a little bit about her writing journey. Just to give a plug for one of my favorite books that Elizabeth wrote called The Release. Creativity and Freedom After the Writing is Done. This book has really impacted me and shaped my own writing life. So I'm so grateful that Elizabeth is here tonight to talk about the gifts of writing. And she's going to take us in some interesting directions, some challenging and important directions in this conversation. So, Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here and welcome.
Thank you, Kate, and thanks to everyone for showing up tonight. I really appreciate your being here, and I always applaud it when writers come together to form community because our practice is a lonely one, and it really makes a difference to be around others who are making similar lifestyle choices. Um, Before I get going, I just want to say that the Eye of the Heart Center for Creative Contemplation that Kate mentioned, I'm going to put um, a link in the website, I mean, in the chat. The website link that I include here is to an online writing community where there's a free course about the gifts of writing, which I'm going to introduce tonight. So if you want to go further, that would be the place to go. And that gifts course leads you into a platform space where I host a community of writers who are writing as a spiritual practice. They're writing for the sake of transformation. And you're going to find absolute beginners in that community and really experienced writers. They're all united by the fact that they use writing as a transformational process. The other website I'm going to stick into the chat is my personal writing website. And that's where, if you want to learn more about me or hop onto my mailing list or learn more about my books, especially The Release, you're welcome to check that out. So I'm very excited to reflect with you tonight on the gifts of writing. And as a way to begin, I invite you to just take a moment to put your feet on the floor. If you're comfortable, close your eyes and take a few deep breaths and conjure up in your mind's eye one of your early experiences of loving writing. Where where were you at that moment when you first started to love writing? How old were you? What were your writing tools back then? Do you remember what you wrote? See if you can conjure up the feeling of that first piece that you wrote. What happened in your mind? What happened in your heart? And what happened in your body? Spend a few breaths sitting in what was coming alive for you as you first fell in love with writing.
This is Imani. I'll make a comment. Can you hear
Actually,
me?
actually, if you don't mind holding your comments
Oh,
till
okay.
the end, um, and I'll give you plenty of time to hop in, okay? But I wanna just keep going here. So I wanted to start by conjuring up that first love of writing because I think most of us started writing because we did come alive then, and most of us continue to write because we do come alive as we're writing. That's why I understand writing as a spiritual practice or a transformational practice. Writing creates us. It connects us to our life source. I think it connects us to our most intimate selfhood, and it certainly connects us to our communities, either communities of those who are supporting us as we're writing, those who are around us as we're writing, and then if we share our writing, to those who read our writing. I also think because writing is a connective practice, it is, or it certainly can become a form of prayer. Um, but it's very easy for that contemplative dimension of writing to get lost. I'm guessing that you're here tonight because you've both experienced that mystical experience of writing, that dimension of mystery and transformation. And then you've also experienced its opposite, the commodification of our writing, the colonization of our creative time by capitalistic values, that need to produce, that need to accomplish, that need to make a difference. Sometimes it's the need to be artful. Sometimes it's the need to be to make a name. um, those those values infiltrate our writing time. And what I want to just share with you tonight is that we each already have within us what we need to get off of that hamster wheel of productivity and making results. And what is it that is the key to exiting that hamster wheel? I think it's your original love of writing, that original flame that burns in you when you write. So briefly, when I was pretty far along in my writing career, I had published two creative works and one writing text. So I was beyond an emerging writer and a pretty established writer. I decided to write a novel and had 10 years of hard work and creative bliss writing that novel. It was a big learning curve because I didn't know how to write fiction. And yet it was also this beautiful exploratory time. I'm really pretty good at keeping a bubble of privacy around my writing process. And when I was writing Hannah Delivered, um, I I was able to do that. But when I got to the end of that book, I made a whole series of choices, which in hindsight, I understand to have um, undercut the heart of that story and my integrity. I slightly misrepresented the book when I was looking for an agent. I the agent, she was wonderful and we worked really well together. We created a list of 50 publishers and sent it out over the course of 3 years, revised the book twice. And she was just about to say, I think we're done, when the 50th publisher expressed an interest. So I really felt backed into a wall, like it was either published with this press or not at all. And at that point, I thought self-publishing was lesser. I don't think that anymore. But I ended up kind of compromising my values to go with this press. And then a whole series of difficult things happened. Um, and I ended up with heart palpitations in the doctor's office. I ended up like with anxiety attacks in therapy. And at the end, I thought, what's going wrong? Why am I completely losing my bearings with this activity that I deeply love? Um, because I also coach writers in book development, I've seen many, many writers take the same path. and kind of self-destruct through the publishing process. So I knew that I wasn't alone, right? This is a plague. And so I started to research it, and there's so many writers who, I mean, Harper Lee, or I think of Mark Doty, or there's many writers who say that publishing undercuts them. In fact, there's even a term for it: post-ritum depression, meaning after you're done, things fall apart. And so I spent a lot of time digging into why this is so, what's happening. And there are just so many pressures on us, internal and external, that work against our creative well-being as we launch creative work. So internal pressures like our ego needs, unexamined motivations, our propensity to just make mistakes because we're human, our limited abilities and energies, those often work against us. External pressures like the pressure to produce, like when are you going to be done? That was the question my mother would always ask me, when are you going to be done with that book? So that pressure to produce, the pressure to make a difference, to be effective, to make a name for yourself, to launch a product. Those internal and external pressures are all working against our creative well-being. And while I have a book's worth of material that I have to say about that, I'm going to focus on 2 points tonight that I want to share with you, and then hopefully we'll be in discussion about it. First of all, to just call attention to how the capitalist milieu that we live in values products. And do you notice that even in the writing world, we talk about making a product? Um, in this in this culture, our writing is only valuable if it's a product, and only if that product yields results. So I would venture to guess that that mindset has infiltrated all of us to some degree or another. And if we want to extract our creative lives from those values, which I think as people of faith we're called to do, we need to consciously change how we orient our hearts when we're writing. So for instance, if you're steering your ship toward publication, so, I'm heading toward completing my project, it's going to be published, and then it's going to meet an audience. If that's where we're steering our ship, then we're oriented toward a product. But if we turn the steering wheel and orient our heart to the process, that process began before you even put pen to page, and it's going to continue long after your writing works its way into the world, whether or not a reader reads it. So it doesn't mean that you're not going to have a product. You might have a product on the way. But it does mean that you've placed your heart elsewhere. Placing one's heart is one way to define faith. I've placed my heart on. And so we can choose to not place our heart on product and place our heart elsewhere. I'm going to suggest placing it on process as a way of reorienting our whole creative endeavor in such a way that's really life-giving and true to that original creative spark. Now, this is hard. This is not something that you just turn the steering wheel and ta-da, it's done. It's something that we have to practice. And so the bulk of the release, the book of the release, is about how you can sustain that kind of practice. So I invite you to dig into the book if that's what you're interested in. But for tonight, what I want to focus on is kind of the foundation for why practice is so valuable and why it might be trustworthy place to put our hearts. Until recently, artists and writers understood themselves to be indebted to mystery. They understood that there was some external force in the world that helped them make literature. So in Greek mythology, it's the muse, right? And the muse is still kind of an active term in writer circles today. We might say inspiration, we might say the spirit. But only for modern humanity has that not been true. Most of the history of the creation of literature, writers have assumed that they alone are not the origin of their work. So Socrates said, if a man comes to the door of poetry untouched by the madness of the muses, believing that technique alone will make him a good poet, he and his sane compositions never reach perfection. In other words, if we think that by will and intelligence and our own initiative, we're going to write something awesome, we're not. No one ever is. That we need to be touched by the madness of the muses. So the ancient poets thought that their powers, their human powers, were insufficient to touch the truth, to do justice to what they were saying. And so as a result, they invoked inspiration. It was a humble act. They did it out of necessity. I'm inadequate. I ask for something beyond me to participate. D.H. Lawrence has a line in one of his poems where he says, not I, but the wind that blows through me. And I think that's what the ancients were experiencing or believed. That's the worldview that they inhabited. Contemporary people have gone through, we've gone through the industrial era, and we're more the rationalists, and we've lost that worldview. And so you and I come to writing in a milieu that believes that somehow what ends up on the page is the consequence of our human agency. But at the same time, you know that that's not true, because where did that idea come from? And where did that spark of life that you first felt when you started writing, where did that come from? And so whatever name you give that origin, whether it's the muse, whether it's God, whether it's spirit, whether it's inspiration, we know that without an infusion from beyond, we're not really capable of making art. Or if you're not interested in art, we're not really capable of moving other people. We have to be moved in order to move someone else with our writing. And so in any case, Lewis Hyde, I think in the 80s, wrote a book called The Gift. And he reintroduced this idea that writers flourish in what he called a gift economy, an exchange of gifts. And that the original gift is that gift of inspiration, that then as writers we receive and we cultivate and we pass forward. So that infusion of gift comes from all over. It comes from our ancestors. It comes from our literary predecessors. It comes from the natural world. It comes from divinity. It comes from our collective unconscious, or just some unnameable mystery, right? But there's something else at work when we write. And when Lewis Hyde said that when makers are solely and completely responsible for what they make, if they're fabricating inside spheres of ego and marketplace. And we're kind of, we replicate what's come before. But real originality depends on inspiration. It depends on that infusion from beyond. So as artists, we bring forward our effort, we bring forward our aptitude, we bring our unique fingerprint to our work, but newness really depends on the gift. That's what Lewis Hyde said. So I'm really interested in what are the practices that support this circulation of gifts? How do we humbly accept that influx of energy and cultivate it, reciprocate with sweat and with dedication and with gratitude? And how do we choose to enter that culture of gift giving? Because I think that's where we'll thrive. And so in a healthy writing practice, we're participating in that gift exchange. We get the inspiration and you've all gotten an inspiration and thought, oh, I'm not good enough to do that. I don't have the skills to do that. That's not a good enough idea. And then we haven't received the gift, right? The gift goes away. And then we've all also had the experience of getting an idea, getting an inspiration, and thinking, okay, well, I'm going to just try. And you sit down and you start writing, and you get a surprise or an aha, or there's a little bit of beautiful language and there's a lot of crummy language, but there's something there that you're given because you've shown up, you've reciprocated, you've received a gift and you've given a gift. And then in the revision process, that circulation of gifts continues. Maybe you get feedback from someone else and you think, oh yeah, that's really great. Or maybe, you sit on a piece for 2 years and just kind of put it in a drawer and take it out again. And oh my gosh, there's some beautiful language there. That's amazing. So you get another gift and you get another jolt of energy to go back and fix it. So that gift exchange is what animates our writing life, right? That's what invigorates us. That's that's the juiciness that we love. How do we carry that forward after the writing is done? And the way I have come to think about it is by keeping our hearts steered toward what I call the process, or what Lewis Hyde calls the gift economy, to that dance of gifts, or you could think of it as the spirit's movement. In researching this book, luckily I had more contemporary Indigenous authors, and especially Robin Wall Kimmerer to draw from. I don't know if you're familiar with her book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and then The Serviceberry. She, of course, so Robin Wall Kimmerer is a biologist and a member of the Potawatomi Nation and a writer, beautiful essayist. And she reflects on what she's learned about gift economy from the natural world, that the serviceberry offers its gifts to us free, and we receive them, or I'll use the birds as an example. The birds receive them, and then the birds scatter their fertilized seeds everywhere, and those fertilized seeds are received by the earth. And so she traces the beautiful cycles of gift economy in the natural world and identifies some very interesting qualities of the gift, which are confounding to us Westerners. Because gifts do not necessarily work the way we assume they do. When I first started telling people that I was writing a book about gift economy, they sometimes got huffy because there's like, oh gosh, writers are always expected to give our books away. And and I was like, oh, that's such a stereotype about gift economy and a terrible misunderstanding about gift economy. So I just want to give you some sense of the principles of gifts because I think it's really helpful for understanding how to steer our hearts and where to steer our hearts. Gifts are not free. Gifts create bundles of responsibilities. So if my neighbor lends me her lawnmower and I use it, it seems free on the surface, but in fact, what's being created there is a relationship of trust. She's expecting me to treat her lawnmower with care, and she's trusting me to return it to her. And so the cost of that free gift is relationship. I have to show up in relationship. Likewise, for writers, we get an idea, it's a brilliant idea. The cost is to set aside that voice that says I'm not good enough and show up to the page. We have to set aside that egoic part that feels inadequate or is, and actually receive that inspiration and work with it. So gifts create relationships and bundles of responsibilities. If I give you a present, that's a sign of reciprocity in relationship. It's a sign of love, right? Um, Another interesting characteristic of gifts is that gifts move. If it stops moving, it stops being a gift. Which is why in the if you ignore inspiration, it's no longer a gift. Or it's also why I think when we write something and we've received many gifts from our writing, we're beholden to that gift. And that means, how do we keep moving that gift into the world? Sometimes we move it by sharing our writing, and sometimes we move it by sharing what we've received from the writing process. Either way, we don't have to share our writing to keep the gift moving, but either way, we honor the gift by passing it forward. Gifts always arise out of a spirit of abundance. So if we strong arm gifts out of scarcity, they're not gifts. So that's when you are, well, that's, if you're a writer for whom money is scarce and you're expected to give away your books, that's not a gift anymore. It's not. But if you're someone for whom time is bountiful and you are able to give your time away and share what's in the book, that's different. So gifts arise out of a spirit of abundance. And I mean, along those lines, forced writing never works, right? I must write about this. I've got to follow this outline. And invariably, that's a deadening way to write. Whereas you're like, oh, it's messy. I don't know where I'm going, but gosh, it's really fun to do. um, that's the abundance that the gifts operate in. Briefly, two more. Every gift is of infinite value. Very hard to understand in a market economy, but even the smallest gift is of infinite value. And so the smallest haiku that you have taken time to scrawl into your journal in the privacy of your own writing studio or your own home or your own bed or whatever, that small bit of receiving a gift and the small act of gratitude when you thank the poem for arriving, that has received the gift, it's moved the gift, and it is of infinite value. And then finally, gifts speak the language of love. So this is just like a real download, you guys. There's a lot more to explore about it. But I want to end with 2 points. What happens when we orient our hearts away from producing an end product toward the gifts of writing? What happens? First of all, the gift moves on the page and it moves in our being. And that's the part that I think we tend to ignore. There's two creations happening when we write. When I was writing my memoir, I was writing about bisexuality and reconciling my sexuality with my church of my Christian faith. And I thought I was writing a book. It took about 8 years to do. In the course of that time, I quit my job. I went into retreat ministry. I came out of the closet to my parents. I came out at church. I strengthened my writing voice. And at the end of those 8 years, I realized that I was not writing a book. The book was writing me. Who I was becoming for having written the book was far more powerful and influential than anything that might happen with the book itself. So there's two places the gift moves. The gift moves in our being and on the page. Two things are created. There's two ways to pass forward the spark of creation. And I think that gives us a lot of hope, because lots of times our writing doesn't make it into the world. There's a lot of disappointment out there in publishing. And just know that there are many, many ways both to share your writing and to share the gift that don't involve publishing. And the second point that I want to leave you with is that when we orient our hearts toward the gift, or toward the process, we place ourselves in relationship with mystery. We place ourselves in relationship with the gift. And so that relationship with mystery becomes a spiritual practice. That's how writing becomes transformational, is when we're in relationship with the mystery that's at work through our writing. So the practice itself, writing, is this practice of the transformational practice of writing is big enough to encompass publishing, to encompass creating a product, but the products are not the end. Who we are and what gifts we're bringing into the world are way bigger than that. And so we can orient ourselves to that larger stream of gifts, which I think is life-giving. It's more in keeping with the life of faith. And I honestly think in the end, it makes our writing better. So, so that is my spiel in a nutshell. I have a closing, but I am going to open it up for conversation and for the next 25 minutes. And then, Kate, if you don't mind letting me close at a time too, that would be great. So yes, what questions do you have? What clarifications? What would you like to add to the conversation?
So much, Elizabeth. What a gift. Speaking of gifts, this is really just inspiring and helpful on many levels. Just in terms of process, again, there's two ways to contribute a question or a comment. You can put it in the chat and I'll be moderating those. You can also raise your hand. Either if you go on the react button at the bottom, you can literally, raise your hand in Zoom, or if you don't know how to do that, you can kind of wave at me or just come off mute and I'll see you. I know, Amani, I think you had a comment during the sort of initial meditation. So if you want to make a comment, I welcome that. And I see Tessa's hand. I'm going to just start, since I have the floor, with my own kind of comment and question, and then I'll go to Tess and Amani if you want to go after that. Um, if not, that's fine. So I just want to say, Elizabeth, thank you so much. And this is such a good reminder, just anecdotally from my own experience. What you're saying is reminding me of my third book, Reclaiming Rest, came out a couple years ago, and I was writing on a deadline for a publisher. It was the first time that I had a book contract before I wrote the book. And I just didn't do it by myself. Like, there's no way that I could, and I've said this to people, there's no way I could have written that book in that deadline by myself. And I've forgotten that. It's a couple years later and I'm sort of thinking about, I mean, it's sort of, again, we get swept up into the like promotion, quote unquote, and the aftermath and all that. But just like that humility of remembering that it really, and I said this with total earnestness, and I believe it, that it was really a co-production with the Holy Spirit. Like there's no way. So I really appreciate your reminder of that. And I don't want to hog the floor because I know others have questions, but my question is sort of what do you do with gentleness and compassion when your ego does show up? You know, a- how do you like not then, because we know when our ego shows up, right? And so how do you then not like um beat yourself up and feel terrible because you know your ego showing up? Like what is a good, and I know you're into spiritual practices, like is there a practice of gentleness and compassion when our ugly messy ego does show up wanting the spotlight? So I'll let you respond to that, and then maybe Tess, and we can take it beyond that. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Kate. That's a great question because it's inevitable, right? The ego will show up, will make horrible mistakes, and our propensity is, especially for women, is to beat ourselves up about it. I actually have a practice that's it's an inner critic practice that involves it's kind of an inquiry practice where you hear what the message is, and then kind of step back and see it in perspective and realize how hurtful and often what the inner critic says to us is not something we would ever say to a loved one or anyone. And so to first of all name the message on the page, step back and get some distance and explore what's the origin of that message. What, in what ways is that message trying to protect us? Because lots of times those really hurtful inner critic messages are born of adults in our childhood who are trying to look out for us, and either we warped their what they meant, or they were genuinely hurtful. And so to kind of tease apart the origin and then make a clear choice to say, no, I choose compassion. I accept me for my faults. Who I am is not my mistakes. Who I am is not my failures. Who I am is bigger than that. I'm going to orient my heart to that bigger process of becoming a child of God, if you will, becoming my fullest self, becoming my creative, living into my creative fullness. So make that conscious choice. And only after I've gone through that, so no, push that away. And only after that, only after sitting with all of that for a while, do I begin to explore, okay, what did the critic say that might actually be helpful for me to hear? And that's the humble part. Like, is there something I can learn from this without that self-mutilation? That's my practice. And actually, I learned that practice directly from an Eye of the Heart teacher, Cheryl Stoneman. So if you're interested in learning that practice, we likely will offer that. It's called, I think, Freeing Yourself from the Inner Critic. It's a class that I find to be absolutely critical for my for my well-being as I write. Yeah.
Thank you so much,
Tess.
Elizabeth. That's great. Yeah, Tess, go ahead. Oh, do we lose Tess?
Uh-oh.
I
You
think
have me?
maybe she. Oh, go ahead, Tess. Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Well, first of all, this is wonderful. Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Elizabeth. And I don't know. I'm just thinking now I may have to sign up for that class because it may relate to my question. Um, I constantly feel like I'm fighting this battle of when I write, like writing from a place of my heart and my spirituality versus like all of the noise out there. And, it's impossible, or I find it impossible to completely shut that out. But I'm just wondering, Elizabeth, what do you do? Like, how do you find it best to like keep as much of the noise out and be able to write from the place of your heart and from a spiritual mindset?
That is a great question. And it's also not something you can wave a wand and make happen. It's a practice. So kudos to you for recognizing that and wanting to cultivate that sense of safety. I I I wish I had an image to share with you, but I don't. Maybe you can just picture it. On the timeline of the writing process, I like to surround like the first third of the writing process with what I call the cloud of privacy or cloud of unknowing, if you're familiar with that medieval text. So to really understand at least the first third, if you're heading toward publication, at least the first third of the writing time that goes into a project is without thought of audience. And I have all sorts of other authors who can back me up on this. If you're interested in learning more about that, my book, Living Revision, it's called Living Revision.
I
That
actually have
really,
that.
huh?
I actually have that book.
Oh, excellent, excellent, good. Yeah, that goes into protecting yourself in that cloud of privacy. And then only midway through the revision process, starting to open Stephen King says, write with the door closed, rewrite with the door open. And I actually prefer write with the door closed, gradually, slowly open the door. So only gradually let in thoughts of audience. Now, it's one thing to say that to you, right? It's another thing to actually do it. And that's your question is, how do I do that? How do I cultivate that cloud of privacy? I have started from absolute scratch with people. I remember working with a client once who was so terrified to put anything down on page that she just simply could not write. And so together we wrote in each other's company, and then we went out to the sidewalk and burned our writing. That was the only way that she could find, the freedom to write it all. Um, and if that's what it takes, that's what it takes, right? To open up that channel between your heart and the page, what are the structures that you need to put in place to protect your tender soul, right? It might mean a password to your computer. It might mean I had one student who had her husband weld shut a box of her journals, like so she could still have her journals, but nobody could ever see them. um, so what does it take? For most, I think how people talk about spiritual bypassing when you kind of like jump stages of the spiritual life and kind of act as though you're more spiritually mature than you are. I think of creative bypassing to be when we're in the beginning stages of a project and we're already thinking about what would my mother think, or we're already thinking about what will the New York Times say when they review my book. That's creative bypassing. And really what we need to do is be present. We need to be in the present moment. Right now, I'm alone. Nobody's seeing my writing. I can write whatever I damn well please, and it is perfectly safe. And I'm going to make sure it's safe by locking my computer or whatever I need to do. And then allow yourself that deep permission. And what comes of that then is deep communion, I think, with that spirit, that voice of inspiration. Which is not to say that as we begin to open the door, the spirit goes away, right? The spirit is in community too. But we need to be very intentional about how we engage that community and not allow the many, many voices that are out there that, for, intentionally or not, are going to sabotage us. So, in some ways I'm saying to you, Tess, I don't really know, But in another way, I'm saying it's an ongoing practice that over time you really can disallow those voices and allow your own creative freedom by creating that protective space. I think journaling is one of the best practices for cultivating that privacy. And even early composing, like these days, I am in a practice where I I'm just tired of the outreach and the publishing and all that. So I told my spiritual director for the next 2 or 3 years, I'm just writing to God. And the only person who's going to see these pages is you. And and that was just my commitment to myself. And honestly, it's been one of the most restorative spells of my writing life I've ever had. And that doesn't mean, of course, every now and then I think, oh, wow, I really want to shape this into this essay and I could publish it here. I'm definitely thinking along those lines, but I'm kind of giving myself that structure is not now. That can happen, but not now. Yeah.
Thank you
So
so,
that's some of what I do. Yeah.
yeah, thank you so much. It's
Yeah.
been so helpful.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Yes, great question. I see that Stanley has come off mute. Let's just make sure. Amani, did you want to jump in?
I did want to share something.
Go for it.
Let's see. Um, I wanted to say something about re when I realized I was a writer. I think that I did realize I was a writer when I was in my probably second year of college. And a professor was going to walk me through the publication process for a journal. And I was so terrified of doing something like that that every time she asked me, I said no. We did that for about 2 years. And I finally said to her, I'm just not who you think I am. And I'm not ready for whatever you're asking for. And part of that was true. But the other part that happened to be true for me was that she was a white woman. I was African American. And the possibility of stealing my words, language cropped up. Now, this is back in the, I'll date myself, back in the early 70s. So, that was a while ago. But the other thing was trust. I didn't trust her enough to give her what I had. So it took me a while, I'll just be brief and stop. It took me a while to realize that I was a writer because I convinced myself first. And I've been doing writing ever since, but based on my own sense of time, my own sense of safety, my own sense of finding those who can be muses for me. So, but you just remind me, when did it first really start? It was that second year of college. When can I own it? Boy, it's taken a while. It's taken a while. Thank you. That's it.
Thanks for that story, Imani. I'm I'm aware of a couple things in what you shared. One is it's really easy, especially in the world, to conflate writer with someone who's published. And what your story illustrates is actually they can be they can be separate.
Mm-hmm.
You can be a writer because you write a lot and not publish. And I think that's a really key thing to embrace as writers, because then we're honoring the process, right? Like, this is something that I do. It's something that's of me, and I'm not depending on the outside world to affirm that, or to kind of give the stamp of approval so that I can be a writer regardless. And it's also a little bit of spiritual of creative bypassing that she was. I don't know if she was doing it, but that mentality of like, we must be published in order to be a writer is creative bypassing mentality, that actually publishing is a really different thing, and we
Mm,
can publish, but we don't have to.
right.
And it can be part of a creative process or not. So So yeah, to like keep those separate is, I think, very important to our tender hearts.
Thank you.
Yeah. Um, Stanley,
Sorry,
yeah.
great. Thank you so much, Amani. Um, actually, I think Stanley put several comments in the chat, so he may not. Stanley, did you want to add something beyond what you put in the chat?
I don't know. Is my microphone working?
Yeah.
Yeah,
All
we
right.
can hear you.
Yeah, I did some writing academically when I was doing some grad school work. And then in ministry, um, I was surprised when a publisher asked me to write a book on the subject of what I was doing and what specific ministry I was doing. And I put a whole bunch of my materials into it, but it was just plain hard work. It was grim. It was just, I was doing it because they asked me, and I thought, wow, I'm going to be a writer. And, but I got a little bit bogged down. They said, well, we'll assign a writer just to help finish it up, just throw a few things in so we can get it published. And then 6 months later, they sent me the book cover and had that person's name above mine. And I called them. I said, you made a mistake. They said, no, we thought it would sell better that way. And I just was devastated. I was mad. I thought, I'm never going to talk to them again. And it was some years later that I was starting to write stories for my grandchildren just for the fun of it and explaining some crazy things that happened to me as a child and as a teenager. And later I ended up describing all sorts of other things. And it was fun. And this eventually led to me writing a very long book about my grandparents, which I hope to publish for them and anybody else that wants to read it. So that's just been joy for me. And the other one is I wrote a romance novel for my wife and read a chapter at a time to her as they were finished, and it just lived itself out. It was an imaginary retelling of our life in a completely different setting, and that was fun. So those things haven't sold anybody to anybody yet, but they were really a joy to do, and they exercised my skill, and so that's enough said.
Thank you, Stanley. I mean, that's just the perfect illustration of um, of gift moving and not moving. And isn't it interesting that that nonfiction book was hard to write, and it ended in disappointment and frustration. And then the works that are about relationship and are intended as gift are joy. And so you receive joy, and then you're sharing your joy with us. So we're receiving it. And so the gift is moving actively in our circle. Um, and isn't that so contrary to the values that we see on billboards and on TV, and it's really contrary. So it's a little bit crazy making to say, yes, that's really valuable, and that's what I want to claim for myself. That's how I want to embrace writing. Thank you.
Thanks, Stanley. Thanks, Elizabeth. So we're running short on time, so I'm going to hand it over to Pam, who has her hand raised, and then we may have time for one more or two more questions. Go ahead, Pam.
Hi, everybody. This is Pat from Georgia. This is my first time. Thank you, first of all. This was beautiful. What came to me is which one to start with. When you have been given, I have been given so many different ideas for books to write. I shared in the chat group my podcast called Joy in the Midst of It All, which is ultimately going to be a book about my journey that I walked with my dad, who journeyed through Alzheimer's. So I started by, writing, quote unquote, the script for the podcast. And in relation to when I first realized I enjoyed writing, it was probably in the 9th grade. And we were doing poetry and haikus and just everything. And I also, at that same time, had to navigate the way Lisa Nichols says, I can be a run-on sentence every day, just in a stream of consciousness. And yet somebody's wanting to write everything in X and red and all these on your papers. Or I wrote a poem on being an idealist, and then somebody wants to tell you you need to be a realist. And I'm like, no, I don't. So over the years, just getting to that point of saying, you know what, I have a lot to share,
Yeah.
just in terms of my journey, just in terms of, like the gentleman was saying, family stories. I'm a family historian also. And just some days, like this morning, I was doing something and something popped in my head to go with one of the books. And it's like, okay, which one are we working on first?
Right. Yeah, you and me both.
So the time box, just, so that's kind of curious how you approach that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely have a very similar problem. Too many ideas, too many gifts. And so there's then that discernment. I always, did you ever play with the Ouija board when you were a kid and you kind of move that? No, okay. I always think about the Ouija board technique and like where is your energy? Like if rather than making a choice with your head, kind of make a choice with what's coming out right now? What do I really feel like writing, or where am I curious? And so to kind of go with your heart, it's really easy for the head to say, you really should do step A, B, and C on this project. But that often deadens the process. And so I tend to go with what's stirring in my heart, and kind of where is their energy? Where is their, because the ideas they all excite me, right? But not every idea like has fuel behind it. And so it takes a little time to figure out where's the fuel. It's not easy though. I don't have an easy answer for that one either. Well, as we're, Kate, did you want to say anything
Go
before
ahead,
I
please. I
wrap
know
it up?
you had another, yeah, please. I know you had another thing you wanted to say before we wrap up.
Yeah. So I think just by way of drawing us to a close, I want to say that instead of writing being a means of ego gratification or making a difference, all this practice, this steering in a different direction is really about making our writing a means of loving. And it's making our writing a means of loving ourselves. It's making writing a means of loving our stories. Jane Yolen used to say that writers' first priority is to serve our stories. We tend to forget that. So this practice helps us love our stories. It helps us love our readers. And I think it puts us in a loving relationship with that creative spirit, with the mystery that's working in and through us. So that infusion of love and that practice of love, I think make for a healthier creative practice and more effective writing in the end. And so in any case, that's what I wish for you, is this ongoing, ever deepening practice of love. And I invite you to join me in that process, either with my books or in the online writing community, if you'd like to experiment there. But thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And let's just unpin you so we can see everybody who's here. Huge thanks to Elizabeth Jarrett Andrew, who's a wonderful writer and clearly an amazing teacher and spiritual guide. Elizabeth, I love your final call to love. And also, I took a lot of notes as you were talking, and you also said, taking care of our creative well-being. And I found that to be a real invitation to really honor our creative well-being. So thank you so much. Thanks to everyone. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to reach everybody who put questions and comments in the chat, but great discussion. And this this has been recorded and will be available online. So if you want to, re-listen and dive a little deeper. And as Elizabeth said, you can find her website online, and also her I'm sorry.
Eye of the Heart.
Say it again.
Eye of the Heart
Eye
Center.
of the Heart Community is another place you can engage with her. So thank you all so much. Have a blessed night. Take care of your creative well-being and love the process. Take care. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Good night, all.